Welcome back to the H3X Podcast. My name is Mark Gearing, and together with your host, Dave Miller, we explore the head, the heart, and the hands of the multiplying church and her leaders. In this episode and the following, we're going to look at the topic of failure. And to talk about this phrase, failing forward, what is the failure feedback loop that we have got to engage in as leaders and churches if we're going to continue to grow and build a culture of growth? And so whether you are plateauing right now or whether you are experiencing the effects of failure and that might derail you, this is an important conversation for you to hear so that you can continue to lean in, understand the role of failure, and pursue bigger goals for the kingdom of God. That's coming up. Any thoughts for you as you hear the phrase failing forward?
Well, I've done a lot of it. So I have a lot of experience in it. So I would say as we talk through it, that maybe somebody can get something out of our failures as we try to figure out what we're doing, and where we're going, and understanding that different seasons have different things that you're going to fail in, even after you think you already know how to do them. So,
yeah, that's good. Yeah, so I just threw up this graphic for us to kind of talk through. That's been a really kind of a helpful way for me to process through what does it mean to fail forward. And it's a loop if you're just listening to this versus watching it. But this idea of you begin this upward trajectory, and then as you kind of hit a downward loop that hopefully spirals back towards the trajectory you're on and continues forward. But oftentimes we set a big goal, and that's where the loop begins, an audacious goal or a big vision. And then we pretty much, I don't know if I've ever tried to start to learn something, learn a language, move to a new city like we're doing, whatever it might be, that I don't hit the wall where it wasn't as easy as I thought and I hit failure. And then the other parts of this loop that are in this graphic of you begin to learn principles out of that, and then ideally you begin to improve and then get back to a place where you feel the vision and the confidence and just the desire to set another goal and keep on going forward. So maybe we can talk through each of these parts, and then love to hear your thoughts on that, or even specific stories for you, Dave.
No, let's kick off with audacious goals. I would say the big piece for me is that sometimes my audacious goals wouldn't be considered audacious to somebody else just because their perspective may be one of more experience, more years, or maybe they have a bigger picture of what's going to happen. And sometimes the goals that I have may seem well beyond what somebody else could even conceive of. And so I think the first most important piece of this feedback loop, of this learning loop, if you want to call it that, is whenever we set audacious goals, that means it's an audacious goal for me. It may not necessarily be an audacious goal with somebody else. And most of the time it just comes down to, what do I understand and what's my experience, and how many failures do I have under my belt that help me to realize where I made my mistakes, learn from them, and then be able to do more than I thought I could do before.
I like the way you say that, because the part of this picture that I didn't even highlight it, but it continuing on upward in that same trajectory is to if we can continue to sign back up for that feedback loop, as you call it, or just the growth curve that it'll take to continue to reach those goals. Really, it's another audacious goal. And so getting around people who maybe they have a bigger vision or a different vision, or their goal is more audacious, quote unquote. It may just mean that they've gone through more of these loops, and they've gone through some growth to get there. I think that's one of the big things for me that I feel like that hits me as an overall truth that I've had to lean into in moving to a new city in this season, is to realize my goals and even my response to failure. It's bringing out my own identity stuff again, and realizing the places where I've got this performance thing in me, or this trying to measure up to others around, comparison, all that stuff. And so, to your point, in setting an audacious goal or setting a goal, I begin to question, and I talked with Dave about this before we hit record, but just some of the goals that I feel like God has given us, I'm like questioning, and I'm kind of wavering a bit, because I get around other people And somewhat because of my own identity stuff, I'm questioning if that goal is valuable in light of what somebody else's goal might be.
Right. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I think identity has a lot to do with our goals. And most importantly, getting with the Lord in that head, heart, and hands relationship. Just understanding what is the Spirit calling us to in that moment. Because as soon as we start to set our goals or we set our identity based upon somebody else's experience, we're not listening to the Spirit anymore at that point. And so anytime we put our eyes on, I want to be like somebody else instead of I want to be like Christ, we're always going to find ourselves going into the failure loop with a really bad perspective that's going to cause us to not want to get back up again.
And then the other piece that I would say with audacious goal setting, and I think this is because this comes from a business book where it's kind of like focused on the individual. That's kind of the way that I initially think about this. But even in the way we frame this podcast of the head, heart, and hands of the multiplying church, not just the multiplying leader, and the leaders. But setting an audacious goal, it means I've got to be confident enough in what God's called me to and who I am that I can, to use your language, Dave, to be satisfied and comfortable bringing contribution that may not be the same as somebody else that I might feel like I should be like or feel like I should compare myself to.
Yeah. Yeah. Because sometimes if you put too much of a stressor on yourself, you reach a little too far, then whenever you hit that failure, it's really hard to loop into learning principles because you've stretched yourself so far that
Right.
you don't even really know what the consequences are or what the effects are of what kept you from getting to where you were going. And so if your goals are 10 steps ahead of where you are, that makes it very difficult. I think too, we might look at it and go, there's a difference in our conversation between a vision and a goals. Like we can have this monstrosity vision, but what we're talking about is what are the steps I need to be taking today, this week,
Right.
maybe this month that are going to get me further down the process. And the closer those are to a realistic thing that you can do within the week or the month, the more realistic it's going to be able to do to learn from failures. So let's say you're in a church of 15 to 20 that are meeting in a home and you're setting a goal of 200 gospel shares for the month. Okay. That means everybody in that fellowship needs to share the gospel 10 times during the month. If you were to just average it out, well, then you come to the end of that month and you go, how'd we do? Well, we only had 100 gospel shares. Well, then you have a very easy question to ask. Okay. Who is sharing, who's not? And then allowing those who shared more to be able to encourage those who didn't, and then to be able to deal with the issues or the problems, the fears, the competencies of those who didn't, and then say, okay, now let's try again this month to get back to it. That's a quick way of looking for those learning principles and asking those kind of questions about what is it that kept us from doing that. But if we say, in that same scenario, we want to have 100,000 gospel shares this year, and then you don't visit it until the end of the year, then you lose all the ability to learn out of those failures.
Mm-hmm. That's good. Yeah, that's good. So, so you kind of hit it already, but as we set an audacious goal that is a measurable step towards the big vision, we're going to have failure that comes along the way. So that's that next part of the loop. And this is where, as we're hitting that upward trajectory, all of a sudden things take a dive, and they're not the way we thought. It's been really helpful for me over the years to use what's called the discipleship square, and D1, D2, D3, D4, for those who are familiar with that. But as you take a concept in D1, this initial idea, it becomes, once you start to take it out into the real world and put it in practice, which is that D2, and that's really what we're talking about here, is when you hit failure, if you don't experience some support in that point, you tend to just tank. And as I've been connecting with some pastors here, actually through another mutual connection, got connected with a guy who's pastoring a church in Manhattan, and that meets in a brick and mortar building. So as you can imagine, starting to talk with him, it felt like pretty quick. There's probably not going to be a whole lot of overlap where I could collaborate with him, just based on what the vision the Lord's given us and what it means to the barriers towards that and all of those kinds of things. So I started talking with him, but found out as I was listening to his story that actually he's been here about a decade. And when he initially got here, he had a vision for seeing a multiplying movement that would reach the Northeast. And so I was like, tell me more about that. So he starts to talk about those things. But then he says at a point along the way, he said, yeah, I came here, I started to do this, but then I found out da 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 da. And he started listing off all these things that he found in reality when he arrived. And it sounded to me like what we're seeing here on the loop. It's like he started to hit failure, quote unquote, or just barriers that it wasn't going to work out the way he thought. And so instead of shifting into a learning mode of how do I do this, how can I learn from this, and how can I connect with others in other places so that I can keep my heart alive and I can continue to learn from what's working there, he shifted back to what he knew, is what I see. And he began to just build a traditional church, which is doing good for what it is. But it does seem like the vision that God had given him got derailed through the failure that didn't shift into learning principles.
You know, that book that we were referring to, you had recommended to me, how to lose, what is it? How to fail at almost everything and still win big. It's definitely not someone who's totally from a Christian worldview. I would even argue to say he's not from a Christian worldview at all. But he's just kind of rattling off experiences from his life. He's actually the author of the comic strip Dilbert. His dry humor was pretty funny to me in some of the things that he said. But one of the little phrases he put in that book that I thought was a great golden nugget to take away is that we need to become married to the problem, not married to the solution. That's good. And the reason that I really enjoyed that is because when we're going after a problem, failure is expected. So what we're saying is that there's already a whole bunch of failure involved. And so we're swimming in a pool of failure. So more failures isn't going to mean anything. And so we kind of take that Thomas Edison view of it, where somebody said, how long did it take you to invent the light bulb, or how many times did you fail? And he's like, I didn't fail, right? I just found 9,998 ways to not make a light bulb, right? Because for Thomas Edison in that regard, he wanted to make a light bulb. That was the problem. And he married himself to that. And he was going to go through every possible solution he could come to and discard any that didn't work until he got there. So I think one of the things about audacious goals is those audacious goals need to be married to a problem. Because if we set audacious goals and those goals are based upon a solution, then failure becomes something that we look at and go, it's a problem. Because, and I'm not saying that the pastor in your illustration was this way, but speaking from my own life, I would say it this way. Usually, whenever I find myself not wanting to get back up after failure, most of the time it's because in that particular area of my life, I want to be seen as successful. I don't actually want to necessarily be successful, right? And so I can go back to the things that will cause people around me or relationships around me to go, oh yeah, he knows what he's talking about. And that's an identity issue. So are we going to come back to and say, what is the problem? And if we can define that problem, then those failures just become, like Thomas Edison said, just another way where we figure out that that's not what we're going to do next time.
Yeah, and I can completely resonate with that, because as I was sharing with you, Dave, before we hit record, I think moving to a new city or engaging in a new work, and for those who are listening and either you're there or maybe you feel like God might be calling you to there in the future, maybe you'll resonate with this. But I just felt like all this identity stuff started to come up for me, where I felt like I could do what you're saying. And as I've started to engage here and hitting a wall and things are not going the way I thought, it does feel like it would be comfortable to just revert to what I know for the sake of, like you said, saving face, keeping the image of whatever I've done in the past or whatever that might be. But the invitation really is to humble myself and become a learner. And it's hard. It feels like it's the like another way to say this feedback loop is it's an invitation to die. I mean, this bottom part of this loop is you die and then you get resurrected is another way to see it maybe. But
and I would also say, going back to it, is like if the problem is they just need me, right? So let's say, I'm going to say hypothetically, you go to New York and in your mindset is the problem with New York is that they didn't have me. And then you're going, I'm the solution. Well, we're not the solution, right? We're just going to be someone who's going to help be a part of figuring out whatever, in this case, the Lord is doing. In the context of the book, It was definitely a business book. And so a lot of times what happens in the business world is somebody comes up with a new idea and they go, man, this is an idea that I would really love to do. And so somebody would pay for it. And so they bring to market a solution that no one has a problem that it solves. And so just because you like it doesn't mean that somebody else will. What sells and what makes a difference, at least in the business context, is it doesn't matter if you're passionate about it or not. Oftentimes you go and find a problem and then you find a solution for it that people want and are willing to pay for, and you have a business model, right, that you can work with. And so I think sometimes, especially when it comes to church planting and ministry, is we get so wedded to a model or a method, if you will, or maybe even as specifically as a tool. And we go, this is the solution. And if I step into an environment and I go, all you need to do is take my silver bullet solution and let me train you in everything that you do, and then it's going to work. Well, the problem is whenever I first got into CPM, disciple making movements, whatever you want to call it, I got wedded to solutions real quick because they made sense. And then I went through a season to where I was wedded to the solution more than I was wedded to the problem. And I find myself in a conversation, as an example, where we were in a training and a young lady got up and said, I've shared the 3 circles 3,000 times and I'm not seeing anybody yet come to Christ. And so somebody said, well, what do we need to do? And she said, just keep sharing it. Well, at that point, we might be needing to back off the solution a little bit and go back to the problem. You see what I'm saying?
I see what you're saying. Yeah, that's really good. Yeah. I think I've experienced that in the business world and helping people do marketing, that's oftentimes to kind of resonate with what you're saying from the business book, that when I've started to work with guys to try to help them market their business, they're really excited about a specific way that they are connecting with their market. But reality is marketing is all about finding out what the actual problem is, joining the conversation, and then finding a solution that actually meets the need. So it's not like what you're saying there, that it's our job to stay married to that problem. And failure, I think, to bring it back to this, is really, it's a test for us of, like you said, it's a crucible that begins to test to see what are we committed to and why. And if our audacious goal was about us being the solution, or our vision was about what we can bring or about a certain solution, then that failure is going to completely derail it. But if it gives us the invitation to go back to, in the case of us and we're in planting biblical reproducing churches, to go back to, what does the Bible say about this, and am I still committed to that, or is my vision something other than that? If so, then I want to find what's the truth in the Word, and then shift into hopefully this third part, which is learning principles, where I begin to find out what are the principles behind the thing that I started out to do, the model that I had, the solution that I thought worked, and I'm finding out this is a different solution, but what are the principles behind how to resolve this problem and to meet this goal?
And I think 2 things to really think about whenever you're going, okay, if I find myself at a barrier or a particular failure, something that's just not working the way that I hoped that it would work, really there's 2 categories that are super helpful to think in whenever it comes to learning principles. Okay, so I'll go back to it. He said in that same book, he said, I took failures, and his principle in failing is that I took that and then I mugged the crap out of it. I mean, I got that failure for everything it was worth, right? I'm going to do everything it was worth. I would say 2 things that we can do when it comes to those failures is, first, ask the question, how's the solution? And is the solution that I have something that's actually working for that? But the second question we ought to ask is, have I defined the problem correctly? Am I going after the correct problem? Because it might be that I just misunderstand the problem that's at hand that I'm trying to adjust to. And so learning in both of those places, are we going after the right problem? And if we have the right problem, do we have a right solution? And the only way to figure that out oftentimes is just often over and over, trial and error. In one of our earlier podcasts, we were talking about tools in the 5 T's for strategy coordinator training that we kind of went through. And one of the things that Kyle said in that conversation is tweaks are better than just completely reinventing the wheel. And I think in that failure learning principles, the improvement needs to be incremental. Every improvement doesn't have to be a complete like wiping clean and restarting, right? If not, we just go crazy all the time.
I think that's a good way to put it, Dave. And I think what that brings up for me is another part of that, the discipleship square, and juxtaposing this idea of failure and improving. And when we're in the failure piece, if we're putting into practice best practices, to your point, that have already worked in another place, and I'm only tweaking it, I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel, then I probably have, if I start to experience failure, it's because I've got unconscious incompetence, is the way the discipleship square puts it. It's I don't know it yet. I don't have competence yet, and I don't know that I don't have competence. My goal is to get to where I'm improving, where I've got conscious either incompetence that's growing, and that's really in the learning principles, that becomes conscious competence, where I know what I know, and I know that in a way that I could teach somebody else. But when it's in the failure piece, if I'm putting into practice something that's best practice, I don't even know that I don't know it yet. And that's what the learning principles piece, or learning principles phase, begins to bring in.
Right. And if we go back to how to even get started, sometimes a paralyzing factor is the flip side of that, where somebody says, I don't know enough, and therefore I'm not willing to try because I don't have the experience, and they are conscious of all the things that they're incompetent in. And that will do that. And sometimes in the middle of all of this, I'll watch people go and fail in an area that I could have saved them some failure in, but it's that process that actually teaches them to go in a new direction, or to tweak, or to learn a principle that they didn't know before. And oftentimes what I think is not going to work is actually going to end up working. And the reason is because I have a blind spot, that my experience has taught me that, oh, this isn't going to work, this isn't going to work. And sometimes that freshman zeal of, I'm just going to go try it because they don't know that something doesn't work, will actually surprise all of us who may be sitting back and going, oh, that's not going to work, been there, done that. And they'll open up a blind spot that we haven't experienced, because we've just decided that this needs to be relegated to the trash can and never tried again.
Right. Which then goes back to, tools or methods are going to change, but principles are going to be consistent, and they're going to endure. So what I think you're highlighting is if we can get past that failure piece, we begin to get into the learning of principles, and wherever you started in this process, discover the principle behind it, and maybe those who are already experienced are going to discover a new way to apply that principle. Or discover a principle they were missing. But then that's where that death process happens. And this has been my experience, Dave. I'd love to hear your thoughts, but I've got to go through when I'm learning something, I've got to just hit this point where, it's like this picture of the death and resurrection that happens here, where it becomes a part of my identity, that in the improving phase, I've got to go from I do these things to commitment. And that commitment comes from, at some point, maybe if I'm trying to learn the guitar or whatever, I really want to quit. It's really hard. My fingers are bleeding. I'm not getting this. And the question is, am I going to push through that pain to become a guitar player? And that's where, to me, that's really what, when we talk about the improving phase, that differentiates from the person who just kind of spins out and they never actually reach that goal or continue on upward. It's that everybody has to hit that point of, am I committed to this? Am I willing to do whatever it takes to make this to become a guitar player, to make this a part of who I am? Well, I'd love to just finish out the loop here, because I think this is where I've been at, is this last section of it after improving is to move towards more audacious goals. And I heard this quote by a guy from the tribe I came from years ago called The Vineyard. And John Wimber, who founded that, he basically put it this way. He said, in the kingdom, the only way to take more ground to move forward is to risk everything you've gained so far.
That's a challenge.
I think it's true, because the reality is, in this loop of audacious goals, we might hit improving, and then we take this loop and we get to where we're competent, but the temptation is to plateau at that point, like we're talking about, and to begin to just kind of settle into the success that you have, the influence that you've gotten out of that, or the business that you've started, whatever area of life it might be. The temptation is to plateau and to just coast on your success, but it's an illusion. Jesus says this. He says, those who have, more will be given. To those who have not, even what they have will be taken away. In other words, you don't plateau in the kingdom. You either keep growing or you start dying. And so I've just felt this lately, this idea of more audacious goals. Really, it's the invitation to risk it all again and go back in. And so even just as simple as like learning the guitar skill. I mean, we can just go back to learning an instrument or something. If I'm going to set more audacious goals, it means I'm going to have to go back all in and risk my reputation. So people know me as this great guitar player, but I want to learn how to do whatever it might be, to play these certain chords or to play this certain song. I've got to like risk looking stupid in front of friends. I've got to go back all in of like, they know me as and it's an identity thing. They know me as this certain person or in this certain way. Am I willing to look foolish in front of them in order to pursue a more audacious goal and continue to grow? Or am I going to just say, no, that's what I am, and I've got to protect myself with that identity, and then that's the beginning of our dying process.
Good word, Mark. I wholeheartedly agree.
So yeah, I mean, I think the reason why I'm just stirred up about this is I'm living it right now, and so
oh yeah, yes, I mean, you are. Like the one word you use over and over right now is overwhelmed.
Yes, man, I'm so overwhelmed to move to a new city that's as massive as New York City, and to just any part of me that came into this situation with a hero complex of they just need me, to use your language, just got squished from day one. I mean, this place is massive, and a person is not going to change this place. And so yeah, it is an invitation to die again and to be reborn into this place of growth. But I think all of us are hopefully are in a place of continued growth and not just plateauing. If you're in a place of plateauing, man, hopefully this provokes you to say failure is okay, and failure is the path towards growing again. But if you're growing, maybe this kind of can help to normalize the process of growth that we all go through and have to go through failure in order to continue to grow.